How does Dickens present Scrooge at the start of A Christmas Carol? I'm not going to include everything about Scrooge here, but I am going to include things that you should be able to use in any essay about Scrooge. Questions in literature tend to be things like explore how Dickens presents something, and the how implies that you need some element of technical vocabulary that covers techniques being used. So I'm going to give you some of the ways that you can use technical vocabulary to address the how Dickens does what he does. First up, the narrator describes Scrooge as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. The ing part of those words identifies each one as the present participle, which are being used as adjectives. You can call this repetition, if you like, because he keeps repeating the use of the present participle as an adjective. You could also call it a list, and the chances are that if you pick any random page of Dickens, in any book really, you will find a list. That's a useful technique to be able to spot in an exam where you get an extract. Every item in this list of verbs is related to grabbing and holding tightly. Squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping and clutching. This use of this list of present participles emphasizes Scrooge's relentless pursuit of wealth. He doesn't just acquire it, he wrings it out of everything and everyone around him. The fact that it's the present participle relates to now. We know that a large part of A Christmas Carol is to do with the tenses. For each ghost, for instance, Scrooge is like this now. When we see him right at the beginning of the story, he's squeezing people right now. If we could peep into his life and it carried on regardless, in a week's time he'd be squeezing people. He'd still be carrying on. And that's the effect of the present participle. It goes on and on and on. We could also pick words individually and talk about the connotations and undertones. Squeezing and wrenching imply force and a lack of regard for others. Scraping suggests he takes even the smallest amounts. Clutching portrays him as unwilling to let go of anything he has. Now, let's turn our attention to the adjective covetous. This adjective is the final blow. It not only describes his desire for wealth, but also implies a selfish longing and envy. Old sinner, this phrase is a moral judgment. Scrooge's behaviour isn't just seen as greedy, it's considered sinful. This would strike a bell with any religiously educated Victorian as recalling the final of the commandments, thou shalt not covet. This builds an overall impact. The entire sentence is a powerful condemnation of Scrooge's character. It establishes him as a selfish, greedy, and ultimately uncharitable man who's become consumed by his covetousness, also known as avarice, also known as greed. I mentioned earlier that it's the narrator that describes the character, and it's worth noting that the narrator in A Christmas Carol is a strong character. The narrator intrudes into the story. Dickens gives it a strong voice, and in this case, two things become clear. The narrator is judgmental, condemning the character of Scrooge, and that allows the reader in turn to condemn him. Secondly, the tone is quite comedic. It's funny. It's funny to string those participles together as if after each one we haven't quite got the picture of how repulsive Scrooge is, so we should get another one and then another, and that's the overall effect of the list. Let's move to the next key quotation. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. This is also from Stave 1 and is the narrator telling us about Scrooge. Now with this, if I were in an exam, I might chop it in half and use each half for a different purpose, but together you get a full sense of the sibilance. Sibilance is a hissing noise. It doesn't need to be repeated like alliteration, but it often is. 90% of the time you see sibilance, you can say one of two things. Firstly, that it brings a whistly, windy quality. If you've read Wilfred Owen's Exposure, think of the merciless iced east winds that knife us, and sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. The first example brings to life the personification of the cruel wind, and the second, the bullets. The second thing that sibilance usually does is bring a healthy dose of evil. Think Parseltongue in Harry Potter, or the history of snakes in religion and literature from the Garden of Eden via the Jungle Book all the way through to Egypt being troubled by the horrible asp. Snakes are bringing trouble, so sibilance is associated with the sibilant word sinister. Let's cut the quotation in two then and take secret and self-contained. We've already banked the sibilance, but now we're going to ignore the word level idea of techniques. We're looking at big stuff. We're looking at characterisation, how a character is built up, presented, and how we're supposed to feel about them. What does secret reveal about Scrooge? That he keeps his thoughts and feelings hidden. He doesn't share his inner life with others. Not only this, but he may also be a secret to the readers. Perhaps we're not aware of these people. Perhaps Dickens is here to enlighten us. The idea that greedy people are entirely secret to the rest of us is a bit far-fetched, though. So what Dickens is really doing is turning the spotlight on them and allowing us to examine them and inviting us to judge them, at least in the extreme. And self-contained, that shows that he relies on himself completely. He doesn't depend on others for emotional or financial support. This is a choice, though. The character pushes away Belle and loses that potential future with her. He pushes away his own family and loses the potential love of Fred, despite the love and generosity shown to Scrooge by his own sister, Fred's mum. This is metaphorical and allegorical, so let's consider why a selfish and greedy capitalist might hide from society. Is it because he subconsciously fears judgment, a judgment that he knows is correct and would condemn him? Let's push that to one side and bring in references to the text that you could use to add to any character analysis. Scrooge lives alone. He lives in a building where his are the only rooms not turned into offices. Capitalism has effectively taken over the homes. He's alone and he chooses to stay there because it's easier, or at least it feels easier. I said before that he doesn't depend on others for financial support, but that's not entirely true. He doesn't need any financial help, but his prosperity is dependent on others, and it's these people he chooses to be far away from. Perhaps there's a hint of his guilt in there already, and he's not ready to confront it. Let's finish with the quotation that everyone knows, and the one I would expect to see in every essay. It's the second half of the previous one, so solitary as an oyster. Already we've bagged that sibilance comment. What else are we going to say? If you want, pause the video and jot down what you think I'm going to say. If you did that, let's go with the basics first. The simile shows that he has a hard outer shell, but gives us a hint that he's soft on the inside. Oysters are also hard to open, just like Scrooge. It takes a whole novella to get there. Where oysters live reflects Scrooge's accommodation. They live at the bottom of the sea, but near the coast. Scrooge lives in a block that is otherwise offices, away from people, but near enough to live off them. Oysters sometimes have pearls, and this foreshadows us seeing the value in Scrooge as he becomes a second father to Tiny Tim later. Despite his ugly outer shell, he does have some attributes we might admire, at least by the end. You might not know this, but when Dickens was writing the novella, oysters were not an expensive food. They were actually a working class food. If Dickens wanted a simile that drew a comparison with wealth or exclusivity, it would have been more likely beef. So Dickens uses the oyster because of its association with working people, because it's a common thing, and the imagery is therefore available to everyone. If you are using this video to revise, consider some of the following. Rewatch and make a mind map of the key information. That's going to help it secure in your memory. You can do the same with Cornell notes, and that will help you test yourself later. You can add the quotations from this video into your pile of flashcards for A Christmas Carol. And please like and subscribe. If you found it useful, please do share.